aiming to educate, discuss and promote the exchange of ideas on current sustainability issue. The goal is to provide foundations and framework through talks by experts in the field, as well as to create a platform for dialogue, discourse and discussions through public lectures and forums that contribute to sustainable future. Before we start, let me introduce our invited speaker today. Yang berusaha Encik Mohd Radzuan Ahmad Tajuddin. He was graduated from the National University of Malaysia UKM in 1987, majoring in finance. He spent serving in the Security Commissions Malaysia for 23 years in the area of regulatory supervisions and development, and specialized in the area of corporate finance, bond and sukuk markets, and operations and development of Malaysia's Islamic capital markets. In addition, Encik Radzuan is currently a short-term consultant on green taxonomy, Islamic green and sustainable finance and carbon market development, World Bank Group, consultant to Asian Development Bank affiliate Sustainable Finance Institute of Malaysia on climate change, and Director of Islamic Sustainable Finance, IFA Consulting Sdn Bhd Consultants. He also a training consultant to the Nation Development Program (UNDP) on Islamic Greens and Sustainable Finance, and sit as an investment committee member of BIMB Investment Management Berhad. Apart, his recent work include project consultants for the World Bank on development of SRI taxonomy, a member consultant of Astana International Financial Center Kazakhstan for development of a master plan on Islamic finance for the AIFC and Kazakhstan, and a member consultant to the Indonesian government for development of a master plan on Indonesia's Islamic economy that launched in May 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that his willingness to share his invaluable knowledge as renowned in his expertise will make this talk a very meaningful event to participants. Therefore, without further ado, let me invite Encik Radzuan to deliver his talk. Welcome, Encik Radzuan, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Encik Radzuan.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh, and a very good morning to everyone. I think by now everyone would have been aware that climate actions, right, requires us to deliver positive outcomes and positive impacts, right? And for that to basically happen, right, one of the key enablers is finance, right? So without finance, without financing, without investments into the various climate actions plans, right, you will not have the kind of outcomes, the intended outcomes that we have set in terms of targets, in terms of strategies, in terms of policies, and to deliver the kind of positive impact that aligns to the set climate commitments, climate goals that Malaysia has set through its nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, as committed under the Paris Agreement, as well as Malaysia's ambition to achieve its net zero target by the year 2050. So all this is not possible, right, without one of the key enablers, which is finance. Despite all the ideas, the measures, the strategies, the priorities that we have set, right, one of the key enabler is finance. So today's topics, right, would explore aspects of sustainable finance taxonomy, taxonomy is basically a classification system. So it's a framework that classifies economic activity, right? We will be exploring aspects of the taxonomy, primarily the taxonomy that's being designed here domestically in Malaysia, which is designed as a principles-based taxonomy. Principle-based taxonomy means that basically it is designed in a manner that we use a qualitative-based assessment designed for the Malaysia's financial sector, primarily for the banking, insurance, and capital markets. And of course, in Malaysia, we have two taxonomies. One is basically those designed by the Central Bank of Bank Negara Malaysia, known as the Climate Change and Principle-Based Taxonomy, or the BNM CCPT. Whereas for capital markets in Malaysia, you have the Securities Commission's Malaysia Sustainable Responsible Investment Taxonomy, or better known as the SRI Taxonomy. Right? Both are designed based on qualitative framework, or better known as a principle-based taxonomy. And we will explore how the taxonomy acts as an important lever to supply the much needed capital to finance Malaysia's transition towards not only meeting the NDC by the year 2030, that is to reduce our greenhouse gas emission intensity by 45% by the year 2030, but more importantly, for Malaysia to deliver its net zero promise by the year 2050. And as committed under the Paris Agreement, right? Let me share my screen with everyone. Hold on. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Right. So I had a talk, I think last year, sometime mid last year, about climate actions. It was really a foundational steps to identifying the key building blocks in financing climate actions. Then we broached about identifying the diverse sources of funds available, right, for climate actions. Either they are from the government, the developed nations climate related funds, from multilaterals, corporate private investments, as well as the financial sector, right? And it covers how much money is needed for the net zero transition, right? Also, we explore last year the sources of capital within the financial sector, potentially from the capital markets, from the banking sector, primarily, as well as the investment management or the fund management industry, right? So we explore some of those considerations as to where the sources of money can be sourced. We also explore the types of financial products that's been used within the financial sector to raise those sustainability-related funding, right? Either in the form of thematic bonds or sukuk, or even sustainability-related banking products. So we explore the various types of financial instruments available that could be used to raise the kind of money to support the flow or redirecting of finance towards financing those economic activities that are consistent to achieve the various climate or environmental related goals, right? according to the IFC, right, the latest IFC report on the kind of financing opportunities, right? Climate actions in developing countries alone requires an estimated 23 trillion US dollars to finance the green transition. So these are just for developing countries, right? Um, uh, and that could potentially create more than 200 million, what is termed now as this green jobs, and and in the process, right, reduced an estimated, potentially reduce an estimated 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see the potential, right? In terms of the size of the what can I term as the mitigation outcomes market, right? Emission reductions market, in terms of trying to decarbonize the global economy as well as economy within the developing countries. So a 22 trillion US dollar market. And these are opportunities, right? Apart from us basically trying to manage the various climate-related risks, right? This 23 trillion size in terms of climate-smart investments, right? Really presents an opportunity, not just for the financial sector in terms of the various product development that they could generate, but the impact in terms of the more than 200 million new employment, these new green employment opportunities within the emerging markets and developing countries, right? So that's very impactful if we could deliver. But for that to happen, to materialize all these ambitions, right? You really need to align and transform the financial sector, right, as the engine to finance this transition towards a low carbon, climate resilient economy, as well as a future, right? But at the same time, right, if you look at the slides, right, I've highlighted here, right, the sustainability marketplace currently, right, is inundated with diverse sustainability strategies and tools, right? And there's a lot of complexities around these various strategies and tools. It creates a lot of confusion because these are the multiple approaches, that's being designed to take us to where we want to go in terms of this transition, right? For instance, you have, tools like ESG integration. You have data service provider that generates ESG ratings and ESG scores. You will have basically strategies on impact investments, right? And of course, one of the key work by regulators in each respective jurisdictions is development of a national taxonomy framework, right? That is designed to redirect, to reorient finance and capital so as to shape values, performance, and impact, especially to businesses and corporations, right? So there are various tools and strategies in the marketplace currently, and each have a different way of how it is being developed, how it is being applied. And for instance, if you were to use an ESG integration tool, for instance, right, or strategy for companies to basically apply, you will see a lot of reliance on this strategy, on this ESG integration strategy to, for instance, leverage on the various international principles and standards. For instance, they leverage on the Global Reporting Initiative standards, the GRI standards, in terms of trying to gain the kind of data and insights using the double materiality assessment approach. You have, for instance, banks in particular, as well as financial institutions in particular, using the Task Force Climate-Related Financial Disclosures methodology, or the TCFD methodology, using scenario analysis, looking at the single materiality approach to gain the kind of data and insights, right, that would help financial institutions to better assess their potential clients or your potential borrowers' exposure to the various climate-related risks, right? So these are key principles and standards that is being applied in the context of deploying an ESG integration strategy, right? And of course, our focus of today's talk is on the taxonomy framework. So I'll demonstrate basically why they are important, why is the taxonomy important, what are they designed for, right? And who are the users of this taxonomy, and what are the core component of the taxonomy. Really, it is basically an assessment and classification framework, yeah, that would allow users of the taxonomy. Users here can be defined as, either you are financial institutions, if you are an investor, if you are a government in terms of trying to design policies, right? And different various users of the participants, right, will use and see the taxonomy to achieve its own environmental related objectives and targets, right? Right. So based on our short conversation earlier, I think we can summarily, understand how basically, the financial sector is basically really a force for good, for public good, right? Finance is recognized as an impactful lever for decarbonization, as well as to build climate resilience. Climate resilience essentially is about adaptations. It is about how you deal with the adverse impact, or to mitigate the adverse impact from climate change, especially from those extreme weather events such as flooding, typhoons, right? Extreme weather events such as drought, right? So how do you adapt to those conditions, or how do you build resilience against those adverse impact, so as to reduce the kind of vulnerability to the various segments of society, right? There's also great emphasis on the need for sustainability and transition practices be dealt with through a just and affordable framework, by ensuring that the principles of climate justice is upheld, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on this. It's not just about delivering a tool, delivering a lever to shape the flow of finance, but in the course of trying to basically shape the flow of finance, right? There's a lot of emphasis on issues relating to affordability, issues relating to access, issues relating to climate justice. Issues about removing social harm, reducing social harm, such as, observing labor rights, avoiding child labor, issues relating to health and safety of workplace, right? So apart from just focusing on just trying to deliver those environmental goals, one of the key conditions, right, and focus is to also ensure there are broader considerations are taken into account, right? they include, social aspects, issues relating to human rights, issues relating to responsible business conduct, for instance, like anti-corruptions, right? Embedded within the framework in the course of trying to shape finance flows to achieve those environmental goals or those climate goals, right? So it's broad, right? You want to achieve, delivering an environmental goals, but it's made conditional that we have a framework that also incorporates this broader social and governance consideration into the framework. Right? So these are some of the key components of a taxonomy, and that makes it more complicated, right? In a sense, because as you basically broach into these subjects, right? Social subjects, social objectives, right? The spectrum is so wide, right? And you really need to basically, design it in a manner that, that it doesn't run away from your core focus of trying to deliver those environmental objectives such as climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, or any other environmental objectives such as, preserving the biodiversity, transitioning to a circular economy, right? So as you try to basically deliver this core objective, right? Um, you should not be overly too distracted of trying to deliver this other broader objectives like social and whatnot. So to that extent, when you design those taxonomies, right, you ensure that minimum safeguards are embedded. What I'm saying is minimum safeguards on social aspects, minimum safeguards on on governance aspects are embedded into the taxonomy. Not wholesome of them, but minimum aspects of it, right? So that you classify this consideration as being qualified as something that is considered as sustainable within the context of trying to allocate capital for that purpose, right? In the context of Malaysia alone, right? If you look at our commitment under the Paris Agreement, which is clearly, outlined through the NDC commitment to reduce GHG emission, our trajectory to reach net zero by the year 2050, which according to the Boston Consulting Group, right? For us to deliver our promise to reduce, to become net zero by the year 2050, we will require something, Malaysia will require something like about 450 billion ringgit for us to achieve that target, right? We also have outlined in terms of the various sectoral policies, right? Forestry, forest cover, for instance, is 50% now, 52% now. The latest is the National Energy Transition Roadmap that was announced recently with 10 catalytic initiative. The first phase involved around 20 billion ringgit. I think in a matter of weeks or if not months, we can expect the government to announce its inaugural carbon pricing policy. It will be very interesting to see, how this pans out in terms of how the government plans to price carbon. Of course, we do have currently the voluntary pricing mechanism through Bursa's BCX subsidiary for voluntary carbon markets. It's a form of carbon pricing, right? But I think by and large, the broader society, the broader business community is looking at a more policies in terms of how the government intends to price carbon moving forward. There's a lot of expectations that that the government might set up, for instance, an emission trading scheme, right? That's based on the cap and trade system, like the one we have in the EU and China in terms of trying to basically reduce emissions for the hard to abate sectors, economic sectors, such as cement, steel, the oil and gas industry, right? Putting a cap on their annual emission annually. That's a form of carbon pricing. That would be interesting to see whether that's embedded in the upcoming carbon pricing policy. Alternatively, the government could introduce carbon tax, for instance, right, on various key sectors of the economy, the hard to abate sectors, sectors that has high emissions, right? Whether that would pan out, we will see over the next weeks or coming months, right? We also have yet to see the government announcing about the national adaptation plans. This is important in terms of reducing the vulnerability of our communities or society to the extreme weather events. In Malaysia, of course, it is about flood, right? So having a national adaptation plans will really outline a methodological and systematic way on how to address this. To build the kind of resilience and to reduce the kind of vulnerability to communities and societies, and to prevent the kind of unmanageable outflows of funds arising from the impact of these extreme events such as flooding, whatnot. So it's important for us to have the national adaptation plans as well. Let's see how this pans out over the next course, right? And of course, in the context of all these ambitions and commitments, it is all about trying to deliver them by having the kind of financial resources to support these commitments and these ambitions, right? And that's why it's important to build the alignment, because as we speak today, right, the fiscal resources post COVID-19 recovery is rather limited. You've seen, for instance, the domestic debt has grown to about 1.5 trillion ringgit, right? And there's not a lot of room for the government to maneuver and try to finance all this transition towards a green economy, right? And that left a lot of reliance on the role of the financial sector, right? So you need to build the alignment, right, to basically help redirect private money, private capital, right, to basically and scale those private capital and private money to accelerate the transition and reinforce the fiscal capability of the government to basically accelerate the kind of transition towards meeting either the NDC or net zero, right? And that's where development of the sustainable finance taxonomy is important, and to drive the kind of a transition towards the green economy, right? Feel free to be, because I can't see my chat box here, but feel free to, as I speak, right, feel free to basically put in your queries in the chat box, and I'll try to address them later, perhaps upon us completing this session, right? So it's imperative, therefore, it's imperative to design a credible taxonomy. I mentioned about the alignment between the government's commitments and the financial sector, how important they are in terms of mobilizing the kind of finance, right, towards sustainable economic activities. So it's imperative to design a credible taxonomy from that perspective, right? One of the key design principles of defining an effective taxonomy is the group of 20 key principles to taxonomy development, where it inspires the foundational development of a taxonomy framework to promote consistency as well as interoperability, When I say interoperability, it means that our taxonomy, our framework, our domestic framework should be consistent and aligned with other taxonomies, either regionally or globally. That meaning that it could be it, it can be put into practice not only domestically but can put into practice internationally, so as to allow us to gain the kind of recognition and to allow us to basically attract the kind of capital from foreign investors, right? So interoperability is important in the course of designing the framework. So where are we now in terms of in Malaysia in terms of alignment with this G20 principles? They talk about, the G20 talks about, the principle of material positive contribution of the economic activities, avoid any negative contributions to those economic activities or other environmental objective, the need for the taxonomy framework to be dynamic and not static, right? Because it is a living document as it's being designed. Um, it's important for the taxonomy framework to also build a transition consideration. And this is particularly important, having the taxonomy designed in a manner that is inclusive, that allows for a broad-based priority sectors and activities, right, to transition, right, from for example, a brown economic activity towards a green economic activity, right? So that's important to have this broad allowance of economic activities and allow them to transition and create an environment where the financial sector can play a role to allocate capital to these brown activities so that they can transition towards becoming sustainable in the medium and long run, right? In terms of their business operations, right? So that's important for the framework design to incorporate these transition considerations. What's not yet aligned is for instance, both the Bank Negara taxonomy and the Securities Commission's taxonomy, the principle-based taxonomy, right, have yet to be used as a disclosure instrument, right? For instance, there's no linkages. For instance, the Bank Negara CCPT and the SRI taxonomy, right, is being made to link with disclosure requirements. Right? I think that is currently lacking in terms of building the alignment between the taxonomy framework to accelerate financial flows and to also link it to disclosure requirements so that you are able to gather the kind of data, you are able to gather the kind of insights that would help users of the taxonomy, right, better assess and better classify those economic activities and to better and so as to more efficiently allocate and to optimally allocate capital to support the transition, right? And what's not in the taxonomy as well is a science-based taxonomy. The G20 calls that, in designing the taxonomy, right, we need to basically, to the extent possible, right, apply science. What I meant by science here, activities needs to be measured. Economic activities should be able to be measured, right? Based on the kind of contributions to climate change mitigation, for instance, to emissions reduction, for instance, right? It should be quantifiable, it should be measurable, right? And that is not currently in the principle-based taxonomy for both the SRI taxonomy for capital markets as well as the CCPT that covers banking, takaful, as well as the broader sectors of the financial system, right? So that's not currently, and that is where, in terms of evolution, right, of the taxonomy, being a living document, being dynamic, we expect, the taxonomy should move in the direction that integrates, a science-based considerations, as well as to link it to the sustainability disclosure regime, right? Either for listed corporations, for unlisted corporations, right? In the EU, for instance, the EU taxonomy, right, as they are developed and put into regulation as a law under the EU delegated acts, right? The EU taxonomy regulations is linked to disclosure requirements. They made it mandatory that, the disclosure requirement, right, should be based on the taxonomy framework, right? So that's absent currently in our regime here, and that's something that we should be working on as we ensure that the taxonomy evolve over time, right? So what are the taxonomy intended to deliver, right? I mentioned about classifying economic activities, measuring which measures an economic activity's degree of alignment with the taxonomy's environmental goals. Either the goals is either to meet climate change mitigation, climate change adaptations, transition to a circular economy, protections of biodiversity and ecosystems loss, right? So it measures an economic activity's degree of alignment with those goals, right? Then you classify them as either being consistent with the taxonomy goals, whether it is transitioning, whether you are in the red light category or the unsustainable category, right? And that's classification helps users of the taxonomy to make the kind of decisions, right? Either for financing, either for designing policies, right? So that's the purpose of designing the taxonomy, right? With such clarity in the classification, right? Banks, for instance, if you are a corporate issuers of bonds or green bonds, right? So you're able to design the kind of appropriate financing strategy, as well as enhance transparency to compare economic activities, right? So it's important for you to be able to compare, right? So that if you're financiers, you are able to make the kind of decisions to allocate to efficiently allocate the kind of capital that basically consistent was contributing to meeting those environmental and climate objective. Further, with strong guidance, it would mitigate greenwashing and helps financial institutions to develop thematic and labeled financial products, and in turn accelerate the kind of sustainable finance flows that facilitates a low carbon and climate resilient transition, and of course contributing to building a green economy, right? I'll talk about alleviating greenwashing later, right? So designing a principle-based qualitative taxonomy, such as the one that we have here in Malaysia, the SRI taxonomy and BNN-CCPT, right? And try to design it as one that is credible, right? Is really, just the beginning, right? It's different when you try to operationalize the taxonomy, right? Implementing the taxonomy, right? And it comes with many challenges. I'm referring this based on my personal engagement with some of our domestic financial institutions, right? One of the core challenges is really about building knowledge and capacity for those institutions to operationalize and implement the taxonomy framework based on the framework that's put forward by Benegara and the SC, right? It's building capacity, building knowledge, right? Is one of the biggest challenge, right? Especially throughout the entire chain of a business operations, whether you're a bank, whether you are a fund management company, right? Whether you are in the insurance sector, right? It is all about building capacity, right? And I mentioned about the complexity of understanding a taxonomy because of the emphasis and focus on ensuring a just transition. So it is not just framework that solely focus on delivering the environmental goals, but also having the need to ensure compliance with minimum social safeguards requirements, issues relating to good governance, and responsible business conduct, right? And some of this involve, science, and it cuts across the broad spectrum of the economy, right? And to have this knowledge, to have the capacity to deploy this as a credible and effective tool, it presents a challenge to impart the kind of knowledge and capability to people that's working in those institutions, right? So, but it's important to equip them with the kind of knowledge and understanding, right? Data gaps in the context of data availability and data quality is another challenge. These are primarily data relating to emissions and other environmental data such as waste, pollutions, resource efficiency that remains limited, right? So if these data, right, remains scarce, and there is no clear centralized database that captures this data, right? So if you are a financier, if you are an investor, right, one of the key preconditions to making the investment decisions or investment choice is really about having better insights over the kind of strategies or the kind of plans that you intend to achieve, right? It is all about that, right? My decision to finance, my decisions to invest is very much reliant on the kind of insights, that a borrower gives me, right? Before I can decide whether the money that I finance, the money that I invested in, right, can basically deliver and can be compared, can be measured, right, can meet the kind of targets that has been set by those businesses, right? So having that data and insight is key, and currently we have a gap, and we do not have a centralized database to do that. Of course, the central bank and the Securities Commission, through its Joint Climate Change Committee, or the JC3, right, a multi-stakeholder platform for implementation of the taxonomies, is trying very hard to bridge the kind of information gap that's currently prevailing in the marketplace, in the sustainability marketplace. Other specific observations is fragmented practices from the various institutions. Each bank has its own practices, right? And that could potentially add the cost of doing business for borrowers, especially for small borrowers, right? Some borrowers, they have financing facilities, or they apply financing policies from various financial institutions, right? Imagine you're going You go to bank A, bank B, bank C, each have its own different framework, right? And imagine the kind of cost that I have to incur to cater or to accommodate different frameworks from different banks, right? That would certainly increase my cost of doing business, and that fragmentation needs to be addressed, right? We need to have more uniformity. Why? Or why is it fragmented? Because it is a principles-based taxonomy, right? It's a qualitative assessment. It leaves a lot of room for individual users of the taxonomy, right, to interpret, right, to design its own methodology or framework to apply and put that into practice, right? Similarly, the taxonomy framework have not basically been significantly effective in terms of product development, um, uh, in terms of designing the kind of innovative financial products or instruments to basically help financial institutions to better allocate capital and support the transition. And of course, one of the key observation is the sustainability in exclusion. I call it sustainability exclusion or the ESG exclusion within the sustainability marketplace. Primarily, it's more glaring among people among people in the street or men in the street or the small retail participants, right? If you look at the current concentration, most knowledge is built for the C-suites, senior management, while retail consumers are left behind, not knowing how to manage their sustainability risks, as well as how they can capture on new emerging opportunities. As a result, I mentioned about the potential 222 trillion marketplace within the developing economies. So this information asymmetry, right, needs to be dealt with. The same can also be said of Islamic sustainable finance, right? Based on my observations, there's a lot of riding on this quote, false narrative that Islamic finance ethical considerations aligns with contemporary sustainability practices, right? I know this sounds harsh, right? But yet, it does not offer any credible Islamic sustainable finance framework, right, to support that, right? It is all about the framework, right? You can have all this narrative about how aligned you are with each other, right? But ultimately, you need to have the framework. For instance, if Islamic finance previously is driven by the negative or exclusionary framework, right? No riba, no gara, no maisir, or no non-halal activities. Similarly here, as you broaden the framework to include this broader environmental, social, and governance considerations, right? It must come in the form of a framework, right? Similar to the negative screening framework, right? It could come in the form of a positive screening framework, right? So you broaden the framework to include these broader considerations, right? In the absence of that, right? So those narratives are are kind of a bit hollow in terms of form, but not in terms of substance, right? So I'll be going a bit more quickly. So why do most taxonomy frameworks adopt a traffic light system? A traffic light systems, I mentioned earlier about the classification systems that allows for it to be more inclusive, to allow for broader economic activities to basically transition, right? So why do most taxonomy frameworks adopts this traffic light system? Well, they are really intended to foster greater inclusion. I mentioned earlier this broader scope of economic activities to allow them to transition and not just focus on allocating capital for green activities, such such as the one that you have in the EU taxonomy regulation, right? Which predominantly trying to just define green economy activities, right? But a traffic light systems, right, have this broader flexibility to allow even brown economy activities, right, to transition on conditions that, you know, it have a credible transition strategy, right, and whatnot. But okay, that's a point that we would be discussing later. But by and large, a taxonomy, right? A taxonomy basically, you know, focuses on identifying, you know, and determining the environmental objective, either climate change mitigation or climate change adaptations, right? And one of the core component of the taxonomy framework is really to design the assessment framework, right? How do you assess economic activities as being environmentally sustainable, right? So some of the key criteria include determining the level of contribution of the economic activities towards, for instance, emission reduction, right? Avoiding of emissions, right? Building of carbon sinks, right? So to what extent, right, have you substantially contributed to those goals, right? So that's one key element, substantial contribution. Some use the term more loosely, right, to allow for greater inclusion. For instance, you know, contributing positive impact towards climate goals, which is slightly more loosely than substantial or material contribution in terms of its usage, to allow the kind of flexibility of various economic activities to be classified and for capital to be allocated for those purposes. Another key criteria is do no significant harm, right? Apart from material contribution or positive contribution, is criteria that constitute no significant harm. Meaning that as you try to contribute to environmental objective, you should not do harm to other environmental objectives, such as, you know, climate change adaptation, towards the biodiversity, in terms of waste, in terms of pollution, right? So within the scope of environmental goals, right? Apart from ensuring substantial contribution, you must also ensure, you know, that, you know, there should not be business operations that contributed toward, you know, emitting waste, addressing pollutions, right? How efficiently do you use your natural resource, right? So that is also part of the assessment criteria of a taxonomy framework. One is substantial contribution. Second is the do no significant harm, right? And as you identify those gaps, right, it requires a good level of remedial measures, which is also another component of the taxonomy, right? Then the other component, social aspects or social safeguards, right? I mentioned about minimum earlier, right? It's not intended to address social objective, but really to ensure that as you contribute towards addressing environmental goals or climate goals, right? You must observe this minimum social aspects of your business operations. For instance, observing on child labor, issues relating to child labor, issues relating to decent wages, issues relating to human rights, for instance, in terms of unions, right? So these are additional criteria that would qualify an economic activity for those sustainable capital, right? And if you don't meet these requirements, right? Technically, right, you would not qualify for purposes of financing the economic activities, right? And of course, the other component, other than I mentioned earlier about if there's gap, these remedial measures for transition, which is a key component of the taxonomy, which we will later broach, and also to avoid prohibited activities, for instance, issues relating to anti-corruptions and whatnot. Right? And of course, being principle-based, the use of external verification and certification by independent third parties, right? Especially in terms of validating those remedial measures or addressing those sustainability gaps against certain standards, either domestically or internationally, right? So in designing a green taxonomy, while environmental considerations and objectives takes priority. So I mentioned about increasing the taxonomy's usability, right? So to increase the taxonomy's usability in classifying activities, user guidance is key, right? By deploying key methodologies. Right? Now, the classification is interesting in a sense that it allows you classification based, for instance, based on the traffic light system, right? It's unique in a sense that it allows you to make the kind of comparison, allows you to make the kind of investment decision or investment choice that allows you to efficiently allocate capital that's more targeted in terms of trying to deliver the intended outcome, right? The intended objective, as well as the impact that's clearly aligned with those climate goals. And for this to happen, right? You need the kind of methodologies that would help strengthen this qualitative based assessment, right? Which is principles based, right? I mentioned earlier, right? They include the use of decision tree, as you can see in the diagram there, right? You can see that decision tree processes, and they are assisted by guiding questions. And of course, complementing these are the various use cases that will support that, right? This include building granularity in the guiding questions, right? For every component of the assessment criteria, the environmental objective, the no significant harm, the social aspects, the transition remedial measures, right? You will have granularity in terms of the guiding questions, right? In a sense, it becomes like a binary approach to direct you for purpose of those classification, right? And in the context of the BNM climate change and principles-based taxonomy, it further seeks to supplement this classification through the use of or through leveraging on the Islamic finance value-based intermediation sectoral guides, where it covers sustainability assessments of business activities from various economic sectors, such as oil palm, renewable energy, energy efficiency, all the way, manufacturing, construction, infrastructure, manufacturing, right? So that sectoral guides under the value-based intermediation complements the use of these key methodologies of decision tree, guiding questions, and of course, in terms of the use cases based on the VBI's sectoral guides I mentioned earlier. So, so that clarity and that guidance is important in terms of enhancing in terms of the traction of using the taxonomy, because you are really looking at two opposite approach in designing taxonomy. I mentioned earlier about the G20 principle, science-based activities, which is science-based driven in terms of its design, where each economic activities under that science-based taxonomy, right, are identified in terms of its threshold, right, the activities threshold. For instance, if it's to deliver, right, if the economic activity is to deliver climate change mitigation in terms of emission reductions, carbon reductions, right, that economic activity, right, would have a specific threshold for it to qualify as being sustainable, right? You will have the metrics, you will have the threshold in terms of its emission, right? Based on science, based on the activities and the sectors evidence-based emissions data, right? So you will have a baseline and you will have a target, and that target is the threshold, right? If you breach the threshold, then you will not qualify as sustainable, and you will not qualify for those financing. Right? I mentioned earlier about the use of certification, verifications, and standards. Right? They often supplement the assessment and due diligence process within a qualitative-based framework or principle-based framework. They serve to add credibility. They serve to alleviate greenwashing or impact washing. They serve to address sustainability gaps. They serve to facilitate transition measures or the remedial measures for transition, especially on issues relating to do no significant harm or gaps in the social consideration, social aspects, right? They are primarily undertaken by third parties to certify and verify the management of remedial measures on residual harm and address those social aspects, right? So it gives the kind of quality assurance to users for purposes of reporting and purposes of disclosures. And of course, it gives credible insights if you are a financier or if you are an investor, right? And this is where they differ. This is where taxonomy framework differs from the other strategies or the other tools such as ESG rating, ESG scores, or ESG, where ESG rating or ESG scores, do not have this methodology of applying certification, verifications, and standards as they try to provide the kind of rating and scores in terms of the environmental performance of a company or a corporation or business activity, right? So I will just skip this. These are the users I mentioned earlier about, how to basically enhance traction on the usability of the taxonomy by these various users, right? The need for greater work on building awareness, knowledge, capacity building, and training on the practical application of the taxonomy, especially from the perspective of promoting finance flows towards those economic activities, right? So I'm trying to highlight here some of the issues and challenges of designing and implementing a taxonomy, right? Within the context of Malaysia's taxonomy, the current taxonomy, both the SRI taxonomy and the CCPT, takes a sector agnostic approach in designing the taxonomy framework. Based on this sector agnostic approach, meaning that you're covering all sectors of the economy in designing the taxonomy. As a result, they eludes prioritization and complicates mitigating the trade-off between environmental performance and business performance. What I'm trying to say here, that this sector agnostic approach will have implication. They would have implications, right? For instance, currently, we see this ESG bandwagon, right? Everybody's riding on this ESG bandwagon, which has its pros and its cons, right? Um, and to a point where you see extremism in ESG, right? Or extremism in terms of sustainability practices, right? To drive business operations to align themselves either towards net zero or meeting the NDCs, right? Purely based on this sector agnostic approach, right? Covering all sectors and economic activities, right? Could potentially fuel this pushback, right? This fueling of this growing anti-ESG movement, especially in the West. And now it's trickling here domestically. You've seen I think you've seen the latest write-up or articles that that brands ESG as being satanic, right? So I'm not going into that, but what I'm saying is there is this growing anti-ESG movement. The point I'm trying to make is that if we deploy this extremism in ESG, right, chances are you could potentially fuel the pushback against this anti-ESG movement, right? And whatnot, and that would derail our effort in trying to accelerate the kind of transition to meet those climate goals. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is a principle-based taxonomy must evolve, both in terms of in scope, in terms of its targets, and in terms of ensuring close alignment with climate goals, right? As you evolve, right, you would basically try to move away from an approach that's less targeted towards one that's more targeted, so that you can optimally allocate capital that's can focus on activities that has the most potential to contribute towards meeting those climate goals, right? Additionally, a non-targeted approach, right, to meeting this environmental objective could also potentially bring the unintended consequences, right? While promoting all corporates to align with meeting the goals, they also risk businesses being less competitive, right? Owing to the higher ESG compliant costs, leading to higher cost of doing business. And this is important, especially from the context of a developing country. Yeah? We are in a region surrounded by other emerging economies. Every economies are trying to be as competitive as possible, right? And compete for the limited resource available for them to attract the kind of FDIs into their countries, and so that you create the kind of economy that create jobs, create decent wage, right? Uplifting the living of standards and whatnot. So we have to be very, very careful in terms of balancing ourselves so as not to bring the unintended consequences. Second is issues and challenges in terms of assessing removal harm at entity level or a transaction level activity. If you look at the CCPT framework, right, one of the requirements of the CCPT is that in the course of removing those residual harm, right, it is not only focusing on the transactional activity that you're trying to finance, right? The CCPT framework requires you, for instance, as a user of the taxonomy, to also assess the removal of harm at the entity level, right? So that could potentially pose a challenge to any entities that goes to a bank wanting to raise finance to to transition itself out of its brown activities to a green, right? Apart from solely focus on financing or transitioning the activity, at the same time, it has to focus at the entity level, right, on how to address this or remove this gap in terms of removing harm at the entity level, meaning that the entity would have to broaden its scope, from just looking at their capex in terms of the investment that they plan to make to ensure transition for that activities, but they are now required under the CCPT framework to also ensure this removal of harm at the entity level. Imagine if you have a host of other activities, right, within the company. So imagine the kind of work that it has to do, the kind of cost that it involves. Whether the question is whether this is the right approach, right, in terms of building that requirement in the framework. And of course, this differ from the EU taxonomy, where the focus of removing harm is only at the transaction level. The issue has always been, when we design a taxonomy framework, right, we would try to avoid or alleviate imposing undue burden on those users of the taxonomy. In this context, the key stakeholders are the businesses or the corporations. Right? And of course, one of the other key challenge is the CCPT framework that make reference to financial institutions in Malaysia to play this added role away or departing from their traditional credit provision services to also provide sustainability advisory services and to play a nudging role for their existing borrowers as well as their new borrowers to transition and to provide the kind of transition finance for those entities, right? And these are being made more complicated from the perspective of whether the banks have the capacity, the advisory capacity and capability to evaluate entity level transition strategies. So for instance, how does banks determine a credible transitions, right? Do they have the framework in place to ensure that? What are the guiding principles? And coming back to the issue of the undue burden, right? Who bears this cost? Will borrower ultimately pays for these added services by the banks, or is it pro bono, right? So these are some of the key issues in terms of how banks operationalize their sustainability framework and the expectation for them to provide the kind of advisory services and play the kind of a nudging role to encourage their borrowers to transition. And we talked about the ESG exclusion earlier, issues and challenges. We talk about key dimensions that makes up pathways toward a climate resilient development, right? Now, if the approach is about ESG exclusion, especially to where participation from the small investors, consumers are not included, right? They are being left behind. If the approach of imparting knowledge is not about diversity but about singularity, right? If the approach leads to information asymmetry where different stakeholders make different decisions purely on the basis of a different set of information given to different participants, then you could potentially, move in a direction, towards a pathways that could lead towards unsustainable development, that could lead towards, entrenched systems in terms of the old ways, in terms of locking in the kind of technology that continues to emit high emissions. You could potentially lead to maladaptations. You could also lead to rising emissions instead, because of these exclusionary dimensions in terms of our approach. The impact, losses on assets, right? In terms of illiquidity of those assets, you could see value impairment, you could see those assets being stranded, all because consumers, participants are not given the kind of information necessary to manage their risk and also to basically capture the kind of opportunities available, right? So that's basically, ends my presentation. I think I will stop here and I would be happy to take on any questions or have a conversation on some of these issues. Right. Over back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Encik Radzuan, for that very comprehensive information. Okay, we realize that there is an urgent alarm in order to mitigate the climate change issue, and it must to strategize the adaptation strategy in regards to climate change. And we can see that low carbon, energy efficient, eco-friendly project and climate adaptable economy is one of the key goals of government agency and policy maker. So I think it's time for us to open the questions from audience. The participants may drop the questions via our chat box here. Okay, there's one questions from Rashika, Faculty of Law, UKM. The question is, Encik Radzuan, since climate change impact differ from one area to another, should the taxonomy be designed bottom up? For example, business green activities to increase resiliency of fishermen or people living on the coast or trade from the sea level rise?
Hello. Oh, you mean the one by how should the taxonomy be designed bottoms up?
Yes.
Yeah. The taxonomy is designed on the basis of setting environmental goals, right? First and foremost, and how environmental goals are designed is really aligning ourselves with the global goals. So in this context, global goals is basically outlined under the Paris Agreement. And one of the key priority areas is climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. The two key core focus under the Paris Agreement, and of course, finance is one of them. And if you were to cascade that in terms of finance, in terms of how we align the financial sector with those environmental goals. Now, designing the sustainable finance taxonomy, right, aligns itself to those Paris goals, right, in terms of its priorities, in terms of determining the environmental goals. I'm trying to be systematic here and methodological. So the priority is really about identifying the environmental goals. And if you look at the existing taxonomy globally, right? Globally, not just in Malaysia, not just in the region ASEAN. For instance, if you look at the ASEAN taxonomy framework, if you look at the EU taxonomy framework, right? If you look at frameworks, taxonomy framework elsewhere globally, right? all the taxonomy have these two environmental objectives: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptations. Now, to answer the question from Puan Raskia, climate change adaptation has been dealt with in all frameworks, all taxonomy frameworks, right? Where building climate resilience in terms of delivering and mitigating the adverse impact of climate change, right, is part of that, right? One of the key, let me see, with the share. And one of the key, let me see, those that. It's okay, it's not there. My slide is not there anymore. One of the key consideration is on adaptation, and of course there's from a climate action perspective, right? If you look at the degree of focus, there's a lot of focus on decarbonization and less on less on adaptations, right? And this is where the role of government, the role of fiscal expenditure comes into the picture in terms of building the kinds of climate resilience, of financing climate resilience to mitigate the adverse impact of extreme weather events, especially on vulnerable populations. And I think more needs to be done in terms of aligning the financial sector with adaptation for purposes of adaptation finance, so as not to overly reliant on government fiscal capacity to basically allocate capital for purpose of building the kind of climate resilience or climate adaptations projects. Right. By and large, right, how you could potentially scale the kind of sustainable finance for purpose of adaptations and building resilience is really about governments and sectors of the financial sector, right, to de-risk some of this, to provide the kind of de-risking solutions towards some of these climate adaptation projects to build the resilience, for instance, to help those fishermen and whatnot, right, against extreme weather events. And this is where underwriting solutions from takaful operators, de-risking underwriting solutions from the insurance sectors, right, towards those projects, right, would basically help mobilize commercial finance, right, to allocate towards adaptation finance, right, because it lowers the commercial risk, and as you lowers the commercial risk through the de-risking solutions, right, it will attract participation by the financial sector, by investors towards adaptation finance and help achieve the adaptation objectives, right. Similarly, on the part of governments, right, what the government can do is basically to encourage blended finance, right, meaning that government comes in the form of providing credit enhancement, providing guarantees, right, and to financial institutions, and that allows for investors and private sectors, right, to basically allocate more capital towards those adaptation financing. Right? I hope that answers the question in terms of trying to align the financial sector to help adaptation finance through those blended finance strategy, de-risking strategy. Right?
Okay, thank you, Encik Radzuan. We do have another one's questions. Okay, are there any specific guidelines or principles that can help policymaker strike a balance between environmental goals and social equity?
Where is the question? Again, can you repeat the question again?
Okay, the question is from Encik Idris. Are there any specific guidelines or principles that can help policymakers strike a balance between environmental goals and social equity?
Ah, uh, I mentioned earlier about the just transition framework, right? The just transition approach in terms of designing the taxonomy. Now, if the taxonomy as in itself today, right, embrace this notion of a just transition, right? And that's why you see within the taxonomy, right, it is not only a framework to achieve its sole focus on meeting those climate related goals such as reducing emissions, building resilience against extreme weather events, financing biodiversity, financing circular economy. But in the process of allocating capital for that purpose, you see the framework, right, is designed to also observe minimum social safeguards, social aspects, issues relating to human rights, child labor, issues relating to environmental health, safety at workplaces, right? Issues relating to anti-corruption, right? It's embedded within the taxonomy framework through, for instance, the prohibited activities, the minimum social safeguards, the do no significant harm, right? It's not just about, significantly contributing to the environmental objective, but also about, removing the harm, removing social harm, removing other environmental harm, ensuring that, responsible business conduct. So all are embedded into that framework purely on the basis of meeting these just transition objectives, right? So that, issues relating to climate justice are also being addressed within those framework. Yeah. But of course, the taxonomy is a living document, right? And it's intended to evolve over time. For instance, there's a lot of, for instance, call for the taxonomy to take on more social or to address more social objectives, right? But social objective is not an easy thing, especially the priority is really to address climate-related goals, right? And as you basically curate the taxonomy and iterate the taxonomy in a manner that it evolve over time, surely as the country is ready, the financial sector is more ready to basically embed this additional this broader consideration. I'm sure the framework would be broadened over time so as to ensure this notion of just transition, this notion of climate justice would be addressed moving forward.
Okay, Encik Azwan, we have another one question from Muhammad Taha. How would the role of TNB Malaysia play for sustainability when it comes to the upgrading to digital substations, SCADA and IEDs during flights through vendor companies? Since most Euro countries have already banned the SF6 gas for the gas-insulated electrical substations, approximately how long would it take for Malaysia to follow their footsteps?
So then, can you repeat again? I can't hear you.
Okay, how would the role of TNB Malaysia play for sustainability when it comes to the upgrading to digital substations? Because since most of Euro countries have already banned the FF6 gas for the gas-insulated electrical substations, approximately how long would it take for Malaysia to follow their footsteps?
I'm not quite familiar with this, but if I could basically look at this from the perspective of readiness, right? At the end of the day, it's all about, to basically allow an orderly transition, right? It's about you really want to avoid the kind of disruption, right? In a manner that can cause disorderly transition, right? And in the absence of a transition policies, right, all the way from the government, then uh, it becomes a voluntary process from the perspective of a particular institution, right? Whether in the likes of TNB, whether they would want to align themselves with best practices, international best practices, right? Then it boils down back to the level of readiness of those institutions in trying to align themselves with best practices, for instance, in Europe or elsewhere, whatnot, right? And this is where it is unique in terms of operationalizing or designing and operationalizing a taxonomy. It's all about designing the taxonomy, right? By recalibrating it to meet local conditions, right? It is not about designing the taxonomy, right? Similar to the EU, right? It is not designing the taxonomy similar to Singapore, right? It is about designing the taxonomy, right? That takes into consideration, local context, how ready is the country in terms of meeting the various climate-related goals or other environmental goals, right? It is all about the readiness, and uh, the design of a taxonomy would be credible. It is if it is able to meet the needs of that particular country, to meet that particular jurisdictions, right? In a manner that is aligned with the national ambitions, national commitments. For instance, if it's set to become net zero by 2070, then the taxonomy should basically reflect that. If if the national commitments is to achieve net zero by 2050, then the taxonomy, right, should reflect the kind of ambition within those framework. So it is all about local context. It is all about meeting local needs in designing the taxonomy. So that's all I can say in terms of issues relating to TNB. But if you talk about TNB, issues relating to energy, right? Energy systems and energy transitions, right? I think it is all about how do you phase down coal or how do you phase out coal, right? If you really talk about it's not about the substations and whatnot, more in terms of this materiality, in terms of the significance, right? If more than 80% of TNB's current energy systems is made up of coal, right? So the issue is really about, how do I phase down coal? How do I phase out coal, right? So what are the policies, right? That allows for a credible energy transitions systems to take place. And that really is, the core engine that drives the economy, right? If 80% of the current economy is driven through coal, right, and whatnot, right? How do you expect, the economy to transition in a manner that embrace the kind of technology, changing the way we consume, right? Or to transition from a linear to a circular economy, right? Where 80% of the engine of the economy is still being fed through the use of coal-fired power plant to fuel our economy. So it's all about how do I transition? How do I phase out coal? What's the strategy, right? And we don't have that yet, right? If you look at the NETR, right, there is no reference to coal phase out, right? Yet, right? The NETR that was announced recently, right? They talk about liberalizing the energy sector, scale up renewable energy, but no reference to coal phase out, right? So that's something that I think needs to be addressed quickly. If you really want to drive the transition towards net zero, because why? Because if you really phase out coal, right, and assuming that you phase it out in a manner that you can achieve the energy sector to become net zero by 2035, 2040, right? The energy sector, right? Then basically, you're really driving the rest of the economy, right, to become net zero perhaps, by 2045 instead of 2050, right? Right? Because 80% of the economy is being fueled by coal currently, instead of renewable energy.
Okay, Cik Razwan. Okay, we have another one question from Dr. Shahida, from FEP UKM. From your opinions, which government agency should issue and monitor the green and sustainable finance taxonomy, as the coverage is not limited to finance matter? For example, Ministry of Finance. As present, Bank Negara Malaysia has already own related framework.
Interesting question. As they are now, right? We don't have currently an integrated national financing framework, the INFFF. Right? We have yet to implement the INFFF, right? The integrated national financing framework, and that is something that needs to be worked on. Of course, if you were to look at this, right, you see how fragmented it is in terms of how we design or how we basically try to develop or try to achieve the various climate goals or the environmental goals, right? You have, for instance, the NRCC leading in terms of its responsibility in our to design our commitment under the Paris Agreement via the UNFCCC, right? So you have these periodical reports, the biannual reports, right, to the UNFCCC, and that's where the NRCC plays as the key agency for that purpose, right? And it sets the level of ambitions of Malaysia moving forward, right? You will see this raising of ambitions over time, right? And at the same time, right, you see the financial risk of sectors trying to respond, right, and try to align with these goals, with these commitments, right? And you see basically the key supervisory authorities, Bank Negara Malaysia and the SC, are playing the central role in terms of building this alignment through development of those frameworks, amongst others, right? Development of the taxonomy framework, whatnot, right? The IMF, for instance, the MOF, for instance, focuses primarily on sovereign issuances, right? In terms of financing the government's sustainability agenda, right? So it has their own ESG framework. The government has set their own ESG framework to drive the kind of fundraising exercise globally, right, and whatnot. So you see this fragmented approaches in terms of how to basically deliver the kind of climate goals or the environmental goals within the umbrella of the commitment that we have set of ourselves. What I can say that the quicker, if we were to basically adopt the INFF approach, right, then you will see a greater alignment and greater streamlining of who should be, the one leading the charge towards financing our goal to become a green economy, right? So the only link I can see is the INFF that will bring together the various stakeholders, right? Streamline the whole process of trying to finance our economy to become a more sustainable and green economy, right?
Okay, thank you, Encik Razwan. Do you have another questions from the audience? Okay, Encik Razwan, so I'm interested in your slide from the attractions slide page 11. Okay, currently our Bursa Malaysia Derivative, we have launched our futures commodities product for the investor. For example, future crude palm oil, and and currently we are in the process of COVID-19 outbreak recovery. So what are the short and long-term linkage between green bonds and the pricing of natural resources commodities?
If you look at the Securities Commission's SRI Sukuk framework, right? The Sukuk framework aligns itself with the International Capital Market Associations or ICMA green social sustainability standards and guidelines. So and under the ICMA framework, it clearly outlines the kind of eligible projects that could be financed by issuance of those GSS bonds or sukuk, right? And similarly, it's also aligned with the Securities Commission Malaysia SRI sukuk framework, which have now basically expanded to also include sustainability link sukuk, right? Other than green sukuk, social sukuk, and sustainability sukuk, right? So and at the same time, the SRI Sukuk framework also aligns with the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. Again, the ASEAN Green Bond Standards is also aligned with the ICMA standards. So from that perspective, right, from the perspective of use of proceeds and the kind of eligible projects under those frameworks, it allows for issuance of green bonds or green sukuk into these sustainable agricultural practices that covers the plantation sectors and whatnot. Now, the interesting part of this is that if you look at the SRI Sukuk framework, right, it makes reference to its SRI taxonomy, right? The SRI Sukuk framework,
Okay.
the SRI Sukuk framework make reference to the SRI Sukuk framework. And it says that, you know, as you apply the SRI Sukuk framework, right, an issuer that issues a sukuk under the SRI Sukuk framework can voluntarily, you know, apply the SRI, the SC SRI taxonomy, right? So and it's not mandatory, right? So it's on a voluntary basis and whatnot. One, from that aspect, yes, from an eligible project perspective, you could use the proceeds from the SRI taxonomy for purposes of sustainable agricultural practices. That includes, you know, oil palms, rubber, or any other agricultural activities.
It is.
Secondly, the fact that it is not made mandatory, right, to basically observe the taxonomy framework, the SRI taxonomy frameworks, makes the process less, I would reckon, credible, right? Because it's voluntary, right? Because the taxonomy provides a very granular approach in terms of its assessment, right? For instance, let's take the ICMA framework, right? There's no basic guidance on how to assess removal of harm, right? There's
Okay.
no basically granular framework at its minimum on how to address relating to social aspects, right?
Okay.
There is no granularity in terms of what constitute prohibited activities, right? So from that perspective, I would have hoped that the SRI Sukuk framework would have made it mandatory for it to observe the SRI taxonomy, so that as you allocate capital to support, for instance, sustainable agricultural practices, right? So those criteria are taken into account, right? To
Okay.
complement the voluntary process guidelines of the ICMA standards or the green bond standards, right? So I would have hoped that that would have been I would reckon that should have been the approach in terms of strengthening the SRI Sukuk framework to support the financing of sustainable agricultural practices.
Okay. Means that the in terms of the long-term survival of the financial performance, so it depends on the framework, isn't it? I mean the taxonomy framework that will be implemented.
Again, can you repeat that? I can't hear you.
Okay. Okay. How these the relationships may impact the market over financial performance and long-term survival. So it depends on the framework that will be implemented to the commodities.
Let me just perhaps look at it from this perspective. If we look at the approach of integrating sustainability into finance, right? It is really looking at it from the core, integrating it at the core, looking at it at the core business of an institution, right? Either you are a corporate or you are a financial institution, really integrating those practices as part of your core activities, as opposed to CSR activities, right? Which is residual from your commercial activities, right? And that being the case, right? Integrating sustainability, should not de-associate itself from your commercial objective of making, reasonable returns, right, back to your shareholders. It is really about creating value, right? Creating value throughout the entire operations and entire process. That not only serve to basically your shareholders, but also creates value that basically meets the needs and expectations of your broader stakeholders, right? Your customers, your supply chain, your principals, the government, and the community surrounding you, right? So it is really about integrating sustainability practices, sustainability consideration into the core of your business operations, and it doesn't basically disassociate yourself from the objective of basically obtaining the kind of financial returns that provides the kind of value to your shareholders. Right?
Okay, thank you, Encik Razwan. Do we have another question from the audience?
Yeah, if I may, I think yesterday we have received some questions from some of the participants, right?
Yes.
Yeah, let me read it out here. When is the government plan to introduce carbon tax? What is the basis of carbon tax calculation, and what is the success rate of green financing in Malaysia? Okay, let me try to address this question. So when does the government plan to introduce carbon tax? So I think the government over the past months have mentioned that it will be coming out with a carbon pricing policy. So carbon tax is embedded, is a subset of carbon pricing, right? And they have various mechanisms that the government can deploy as part of its carbon pricing policy. Carbon tax, voluntary carbon markets that basically are being operated by BCX under Bursa Malaysia. The voluntary carbon market is also part of carbon pricing. An domestic emission trading scheme like what you have in the EU under a cap and trade system is also part of pricing mechanism that imposes annual emissions budget on certain high emission sectors or the hard to abate sectors such as steel, cement, whatnot, right? So these are carbon pricing policies that the government would have to consider on how best to basically deploy to ensure an orderly transition without extreme disruption to the economy, without compromising on the level, without impacting the level of competitiveness of our businesses, of our SMEs, without basically compromising on disrupting the kind of orderly transition towards becoming a green economy. So I think we will look forward in the coming weeks and months on what constitute the government's carbon pricing policy in terms of to drive the transition towards a green economy. What is the success rate of green financing in Malaysia? I think Malaysia is one of the more progressive country, right, in terms of aligning its financial sector with climate goals. Why do I say this? Because if you look 3 plus 4, 7 years ago, it was 7 years ago, right, that Malaysia became the first corporates, right, the first corporate to issue a green sukuk, right, in the world, right? That was 7 years ago, right? So you see the kind of alignment with issues relating to sustainable finance, issues that relates to climate actions, right? Where, you know, in 2017, Tadau Energy became the first corporate issuer to issue a green SRI sukuk, followed by Quantum Solar that issues 1 billion worth of again green SRI sukuk to finance solar photovoltaic solar farm. We also have the world's second tallest tower, PNB Merdeka Ventures, issuing a green sukuk that aligns with the ASEAN Green Bond Standards to finance the energy efficient portion of their buildings, right? And that is what, almost 6 to 7 years ago, right? So from that perspective, Malaysia is quite successful in terms of driving and aligning the financial sector to support the government's effort to basically drive the kind of transitions that supports to achieve its NDC and its net zero target, right?
Okay, Encik Azwan. Do you have another question from the audience? Okay, we have a last questions. Okay, in order to implement the green finance, it's differ from countries to countries. So what are the key challenges in sustainable finance that we implement in Malaysia?
I think I addressed that in my slides, right? The issues and challenges I mentioned earlier. Now it's one of the key design principle is really about inclusion, right? It's really about inclusion, how to get everyone on board, right? And you really have to look at this from the perspective of a country level of readiness, right? In terms of its economic development, in terms of how ready is the society, how ready is the community to embrace integrating sustainability practices into its economy, right? It is all about aligning the design of the taxonomy framework to meet those local contexts and local needs. I mentioned that earlier already, right? Why not? So that's the key principle: inclusion, readiness, interoperability, credibility, usability, right? So these are considerations that you have to take and apply that within the context of each country. How ready are you in terms of operationalizing the taxonomy as you design it in a manner that try as much as possible, right, to meet those local conditions, but at the same time, right, it's interoperable, it is inclusive, it is usable, right, it is credible, right. So I think that's the key challenge, right, recalibrating all these components that's able to meet the needs of a particular country, but at the same time allow for the framework to evolve, right, as the country evolve, and to allow for the framework to also evolve. And the ultimate aim is really to get the framework, right, to become a framework, a guidance that's really aligned to science, right? So that you are able to quantify, you are able to measure, right? You are able to assess the impact, right? Because I think at the end of the day, that is what we want, right? That is what international investors want, right? And that's the direction that we will have to go. It's irreversible, right? That's the direction that we need to basically move in terms of accelerating our transition that aligns to our climate commitments. Right?
Okay, thank you very much, Encik Razwan. With that, I end the Q&A sessions. We learned a lot today from our talk sessions. We would like to thanks to our speaker, Encik Razwan, in sharing his comprehensive and insightful talks today. And also, we would like to thanks to our organizer, UKM-YSD Chair, in organizing our sessions today, and thank you for all participants in joining our sessions today. I think with that, thank you everyone, and I end our sessions today.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Do you have project sessions?
Yes, Ms. Amir. And count 3, 2, 1. Smile. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum
Thank you, Cik
warahmatullahi
Radzuan. Thank you so much, Cik
wabarakatuh.
Radzuan.
Thank you.